So, Angela and Nguyen, welcome to Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast. This is now your second time on the show. And today we're actually going to talk about neurodivergence and the holidays. How are you? Maybe highs, lows of the week?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. I'm excited to talk about this topic. Neurodivergence is something that is like very near and dear to my heart personally, like as a neurodivergent
Mm.
person, and then is also like a big part of my clinical work. It's what I focus on a lot with my clients. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this.
Yeah, for full disclosure, this episode is happening because of a previous podcast episode that you referenced to me, a project that you did for your graduate program, I think, at UCLA, where you
Yeah.
interviewed a sibling of a person with Down syndrome. Was that
Yeah.
right? And I
Yes.
think, I'd love to hear more about your journey as to how you specialized working with neurodivergent folks. Like, what was your own personal experience? And then what got you interested in working with other folks with neurodivergence?
Yeah, totally. So I think I actually had a little bit of an opposite journey. So for the longest time growing up, I thought that I might have
Mm.
ADHD, and it was something that came up. It was something that was sort of questioned, but it wasn't ever something that was like formally diagnosed or anything. Not actually till much later in life, but kind of coming into college and really getting into mental health and getting into education. Actually, my undergraduate degree was in developmental psych, and actually, part of my degree is like I had a teaching certification, so I was really closely involved with like the intersection between mental health and education. And it's something I sort of fell into of starting to work in the schools, starting to work like in the special needs classrooms, right? The special education classrooms, working as like a school behavioral therapist, which now looking back, there's a lot I could say about like the ethics of behavioral therapy, but that was sort of my introduction
Hmm.
to this field as a whole. And then I worked for the regional center. So, not to give too much background information, but in California, we have this law called Letterman Act, and it essentially provides and guarantees certain rights and services to individuals with, a certain qualifying disability. So I worked for the state as a case manager, making sure that students had access to those rights and services. And so that led me into my degree with social work, which led me into working with the LEND Clinic,
Mm.
which is Leadership and Education for Neurodevelopmental Disabilities. And so that was a clinic that is a partnership between UCLA and UCR
Mm.
actually. And so that's where I really like started focusing on neurodiversity a lot, and is where I did that project now with Megan.
Mm.
Um, and looking back and listening to it, I'm like, wow, I was such a baby therapist at that time,
Yeah.
and I feel like I've learned so much, and I feel like I've grown so much because since then I've myself now been diagnosed with
Wow.
ADHD, and it sort of pulled a lot of like pieces together for me, and it's what I specialize now in working with my own like therapy clients is the ADHD.
Mm.
So kind of a little bit of a backwards journey. Like I did the work first, and then I got diagnosed, and then I like really started to specialize.
Yeah. Out of
Yeah.
curiosity, when you got formally diagnosed with ADHD,
Yeah.
like what were some of the things that didn't make sense before that now make a lot of sense being diagnosed officially?
I think something that really stood out to me was so in getting diagnosed with ADHD, I did try different medication. I tried like non stimulant medication, and then I tried stimulant medication. And then, you know, as with all psychotropic medications, like it's a little bit of trial and error. Like you have to figure out what works for you, what doesn't. And when I finally figured out the stimulant medication that worked for me, it was like, oh, is this how other people live?
Wait, what does that mean
Because
though?
this is,
Other
yeah.
people.
So, like, for me, I was like, well, is this how neurotypical people live? And obviously, that's like this really broad strokes generalization. But like, for the first time on stimulant medication, I was like, not nearly as forgetful as I normally am, not
Mm.
as distractible as I normally am. And I think it was both like this revelation of like, whoa, there are things that are more accessible to me than I thought were previously. But also, it's like, oh, if this is how like neurotypical people live, that seems so much easier than what I've been doing this whole time. um, so that was something that really struck me. But also, I think it just explained a lot of, there was a reason for why some of these things felt so
Mm.
difficult. And there's a reason why I think I get along with so many of my neurodivergent clients is like, I think there's an understanding here, right? We think a little bit differently. We process a little bit differently. We move through the world a little bit differently.
Mm.
Um, so,
To
yeah.
that point, like I
Hmm.
want to ask you to break down all of these definitions of what it means to be
Yeah, totally.
neurodivergent. But before that,
Hmm.
like I do want to ask, as a therapist navigating the world of social media now, I notice
Hmm.
that there's so much misinformation online about what ADHD is. Like
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
hard to understand. Like you can make anything ADHD now. And so, why don't you break it down for us? Like, how do you know that someone has ADHD versus autism versus Down syndrome going into the topic today?
Yeah, so let me actually do a little bit of a vocabulary lesson first, really quickly. So neurodivergence or neurodivergent, right? That word in of itself refers to the ways that a brain might function differently, just in comparison to what is considered typical, right? And that can be a spectrum or continuum. It can look like thinking, looking, or processing differently, looking through the world differently. It can affect like the ways that you interact, relationships, communication. It can also affect the ways that you experience things, so like your sensory experiences, your emotional experiences. So that's neurodivergence. Neurodiversity was this concept coined by sociologist Judy Singer in the 90s, uh, based off of the concept of biodiversity, right? So, like, this idea that brains are different and it's actually supposed to be that way and it's positive and helpful and beneficial, right? So neurodiversity is like the larger movement of acceptance and inclusivity for neurodivergent brains. Okay, so neurodivergence typically includes ADHD, ASD or autism spectrum disorder, dyslexia, other learning and developmental conditions and disabilities like Tourette's and Down syndrome. Uh, because there's so much new information and so much more new advocacy, and it's sort of this ever growing, ever changing field, there's a question about whether other conditions would fall under neurodivergence, such as bipolar or OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. For the purposes of the way that I personally understand neurodivergence, I don't include those, but I'm like open to, as things change, as things grow, as we learn more, right?
Hmm.
So I'm going to focus on like ADHD, autism, and if we want to focus on like Tourette's and Down syndrome, we totally
Hmm.
can, right? Um, so really quickly, I have a little bit of a mixed feeling about how much information there is online on social
I'm
media
with you.
because I think on the one hand, it's really important that we're talking about it. I think it's been great for breaking down a lot of the stigma and for exposing a lot of this information to people who wouldn't otherwise know about it, right? Or who wouldn't otherwise have any awareness or access to this kind of information. And given that, you know, psychology assessment can be so inaccessible, it can be so expensive for so many people. It's not always an option to get a formal diagnosis, right? And so I think there can be something really powerful and really meaningful in like seeing yourself represented and getting the chance to be like, oh, I might have that. I really identify with that. I wonder if I can find a community, around that, right? So I think there can be a lot of positives to it.
Mm.
And I think, like you said, there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of things that get conflated. And I do worry a little bit about people who think like, oh, maybe I have ADHD, and you might. But also, certain things that can happen in ADHD can also happen in things like depression,
Hmm.
can also happen in things like trauma. And that's a difficult thing to distinguish just for yourself,
Mhm.
right? So that's where I get a little bit worried about like misinformation and, you know, whether things get a little bit conflated.
Mm.
Um, okay, that was a really big rant.
No,
Thanks for listening for that part.
that was awesome. Because I think when neurodiversity, ADHD, autism, they're all words that have existed for a long time, but I don't think it's, like I said, it's not a new concept, but it's becoming such a buzzword now because of TikTok and because more and more people, God bless them, in the new generation are becoming more advocates because of the proliferation of TikTok. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
the younger
Mm-hmm.
population is just more of a social advocate than we were when we were growing up in school. So
Yeah.
yeah, but as a therapist, for someone that um, is trying to figure out, okay, like if I'm worried that the sense of forgetfulness is maybe due to a predisposed brain function condition that I was born with called ADHD, how would you recommend that people get tested? Do they go to a therapist? Do they go to a psychologist? Like, what would they look for online to know that they have said conditions?
Yeah. So ADHD essentially is a executive functioning dysregulation disorder. Um, it's not something that's like based off of one like gene or one particular factor, right? It's thought to be caused by many various things. But the idea is that if you're noticing a lot of like difficulties with inattention or difficulties with hyperactivity or both, um, if it's a child, the starting point is to go to their pediatrician, right, or to their doctor, or to the school, right, and see about next steps. So next steps would typically look like doctor or pediatrician would either do the diagnostic themselves, they would do the testing like in the appointment, or refer to a psychologist. Similarly, the school would refer to like a school psychologist, and you would kind of go from there. As an adult, it can be a lot more challenging.
Mm.
Um, Honestly, I would still say to start with your doctor, um, who can provide a referral if you need to. But that's where, again, like psychology's assessments can be really expensive and not necessarily accessible. There are screeners online that can be a good starting point. You can talk to your therapist about it. Some therapists don't feel comfortable diagnosing, some do, right? Or some might be able to give you an idea of resources of who you can connect to. But that's ADHD,
Mm.
right? With autism, so autism is a spectrum disorder, right? Neurodevelopmental condition. Similarly, not any one single cause,
Mm.
but autism tends to be picked up a little bit earlier, particularly if it affects whether or not you're meeting developmental milestones. And so there is screening, there is autism screening, right? Like at those early wellness checks that the pediatrician will do. So it might be caught there. But also, if you're noticing like issues with sensory regulation, with emotion regulation, if you're noticing a lot of externalizing behavior, so like really big emotional reactions to something, if you're noticing any self injury, right, like hitting oneself or hitting one's head against the wall, those are more significant examples, but like all of these sorts of things can manifest with autism, right? Because it's a spectrum,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
So can be caught in childhood, can also be caught in adulthood if there aren't as many of the external behaviors, if it's more internalized behaviors, like they experience more shutdowns internally, right? It's not this big emotional expression, but it's like the shutdown where you might be dissociating or might not be connecting with others. So similarly, you start with your doctor, unfortunately,
Mm.
right? And then go to a psychologist. You can go directly to a psychologist, but that would be, if you were paying out of pocket, which again, very, very expensive.
Hmm.
Um, Down syndrome, well, that one is a genetic condition,
Hmm.
right? It's when someone has an extra partial or full chromosome 21. We have 23 pairs, right? So 23 chromosomes each from our
Right.
parents. So if you have an extra partial or full chromosome 21, and that from birth, right, affects how the brain and the body develop.
Mm.
And so something like Down syndrome would be screened for during pregnancy, and there's often much more apparent signs because it affects physical features as
Mm.
well.
Okay.
So ADHD and autism, hereditary, but not necessarily genetic. Whereas Down syndrome, it is a congenital condition, so there is a genetic component.
Got it. Okay. So for siblings that might not be sure, you've given a really great overview of what autism, Down syndrome, and ADHD look like. But I'm curious about, the holidays are coming up and we're entering into more time with family. And I'm curious about, from your experience, how does having a neurodivergent sibling impact the family dynamic? And from the other side of the coin too, I'm giving you a layered question. How is being a neurodivergent person present in a neurotypical family? Like, how does that look like? How does that affect the behavior of a family unit?
Yeah, so, well, with any of these neurodivergent conditions, ADHD, autism, Down syndrome, they all exist on a spectrum. So forgive me if there's a little bit of like
Hmm.
generalization here, just because there's just so much here.
Yeah.
Um, but so starting with like as the neurodivergent
Hmm.
person, right? So as a neurodivergent person, um, some folks might not experience very much difficulty when it comes to sensory experiences, right? So with the holidays, with like the lights and the music and the crowds, that might not be very difficult. But for someone who does have really heightened sensory experiences, that can be really, really challenging, and that can be anxiety inducing. It can be overwhelming. It can also lead to like a meltdown, right? Where you just get so overstimulated and so overwhelmed that you sort of just lose control of like your external behaviors. So, crying, yelling, hitting oneself just because there's just too much,
Mm.
right? So the sensory experience can vary depending on where you fall on that spectrum, right? Socially, that can also be challenging. So you're around a lot of people, right? You're around friends, family, neighbors, strangers. And so, again, like if you are, if social interactions aren't that challenging for you, then it can feel overwhelming, but it might be manageable, right? Whereas if they are really challenging for you, that can be really significant burnout, that can be significant exhaustion. It can be really anxiety inducing having to interface with so many people that you don't know, strangers, especially with, family members who mean well and are kind hearted, but like they want to touch you, they want to hug you, they want to cuddle.
Mm.
And like if you don't really feel comfortable with people and you don't feel comfortable with physical touch, that can be extremely uncomfortable, right? And again, family members might mean really well, but they're like, oh my gosh, I haven't seen you in so long. You have to give me a hug. And that's not that understanding,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Um, so that can feel challenging. Food can also feel challenging. So for, folks who have certain food preferences or really significant difficulties with food, so like avoidant restricted food intake disorder, ARFID, where certain foods and certain textures are really significantly uncomfortable to the point where like you can't eat it without maybe gagging or even throwing up. So holiday foods can be really challenging, right? If they're unfamiliar, especially things are more spiced, right? Or more seasoned,
Hmm.
or more rich or more
Yeah.
fatty. So a lot of these things can be A, uncomfortable to eat, but B, it can also cause a lot of like gastrointestinal upset if it's not what you're used to.
Hmm.
So lots of things here that can be really challenging, kind of depending on where you fall. Even just like the disruption of your routine
Mm.
or travel, right? Because holiday travel is stressful already.
So stressful.
But then you add in, like, oh, I really struggle with crowds. I struggle with waiting. I struggle with having to stand in one position for a really long time or sit in one position for a really long time. There's a lot here that can be really, really difficult.
Mm. Wow. That's a lot of emotional and social dysregulation because
Yeah.
you're being subjected
Yeah.
to all of these different people, stimulus. And so for someone that is like I can imagine it's almost like everything for a neurodivergent person. Obviously broad strokes here, but like it feels like it's turned up to a volume 10 and it can look like
Yeah.
stonewalling or defiance, I can imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, maybe transitioning now to the sibling
Mhm.
experience, right? I think, for siblings who are neurotypical, right, or siblings who are able, right, who aren't dealing with any conditions or disabilities, it can feel, one, overwhelming and stressful, right? Because you're seeing and witnessing your sibling having a really tough time. You might feel, you know, this sort of inner drive to help them out or to protect them or to make sure that they're okay. Or you might also feel a little bit embarrassed or a little bit ashamed,
Mm.
particularly if your sibling's having like a really difficult time, right? Um, so you might be experiencing a range of emotions just in witnessing it, let alone in trying to help or in trying to like play peacekeeper, right? It can feel really chaotic for you if your sibling is struggling, right? Um, and on the flip side, if the family as a whole is trying to take care of the neurodivergent sibling, is having to meet certain needs or accommodate, you might feel like you're maybe missing out on certain traditions or on certain events,
Mm.
right? Or you might feel like, oh man, like holiday is supposed to be at family, but I don't feel like I'm getting any attention at all,
Mm.
right? Or I might be feeling like, because the holidays are so difficult and because my family is so focused on, meeting my neurodivergent siblings' needs, now I feel a lot of pressure to hold it together.
Mm.
Like I can't have a tough time if they're already having a tough time. So I have to keep it together. I have to be the one that's independent, or I have to help out,
Yeah.
right? Or if I am feeling something, I have to figure it out and handle it myself. So it can just be really overwhelming to be part of. It can also be really isolating to feel like you have to be responsible and you have to figure it out.
Mm.
It can feel like a lot of pressure to be, maybe a little bit more mature than you actually are, right? Let's say it's a teenager,
Mm.
but they have to essentially take on the role of an adult, you know? Um, and I think too, with certain traditions like gift giving, for example. Like a tradition of sitting around and like everyone taking turns to do gifts, that might not be something that's accessible to your neurodivergent sibling. And so that might be something that you feel you miss out on, right? Um,
Yeah.
and there might be a little bit of frustration with that, resentment with that, and then guilt for feeling the frustration and resentment. And so I think there's just a really complex experience for the sibling of, the ways that you adjust. And very well might have a lot of the compassion and empathy and understanding and still feel, right? Like I'm alone and I'm missing out and I feel pressured to
Mm.
like be okay and to figure it out. So,
Mm.
you know, I think there's a lot of information about, or now there's a lot of information about how can we make the holiday season or holiday traditions more inclusive. And I think that's great. I think that's a really important conversation to have. And I love that there are ways that we can think about how to make it inclusive for our neurodivergent siblings. And I also, though, want to make sure that we're also making it inclusive for the neurotypical siblings too.
Mhm.
That yes, we have to have accommodations. And yes, also perhaps there's opportunity for the neurotypical siblings to go do the activities that aren't necessarily accommodating and to do the activities that are accommodating, right? That there is perhaps space for both,
Mm.
if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense because I think, what's unfortunate about what I'm processing right now is that I don't think this narrative is ever portrayed on holiday television. When you watch
Mm-hmm.
movies during the holidays, there often isn't a unique representation of what it looks like to be a neurotypical sibling with an atypical sibling and how that affects the holiday transition into the new year, Christmas, whatever you celebrate. Um, and I'd love to talk more about this in detail. I think when it comes to changes in routine and social pressures, you know, you talk about what it looks like for neuroatypical folks during the holidays. But I think there's a certain level of isolation that the neurotypical sibling feels during the holidays because they feel like their sibling is getting a lot more of the attention than they would typically want. And for someone listening to this that does have a sibling that's autistic or has ADHD that they deeply love and care about, what do they do with all of these feelings of anger, resentment, emotion, complexity that they might be carrying during the holiday season?
Yeah, totally. I think, well, even outside of the holidays,
Yeah.
right? I think there can already be mm, the ways that neurodivergence and the ways that disability really as a bigger conversation
Mhm.
affects the family dynamic as a whole, right? Again, like the abled sibling or the neurotypical sibling often has the added pressure to be okay, to figure it out, to be independent, to help out, right? There's more responsibility there. There's less time that they get from, parents there. And depending on like the number of siblings in a family, this can really affect relationships between typical sibling, neurodivergent sibling, but also two typical
Mhm.
siblings as well,
Yes.
right? So, for example, you know, the a typical sibling might feel that their neurodivergent sibling is getting a lot more attention, a lot more leniency, a lot more grace, a lot more time, right? Um, whereas the two typical siblings together, not necessarily because it's any one person's fault. Um, I do though see some rivalry sometimes and some competitiveness. Like there's only so much parental attention that's available, right? So trying to get some of that,
Mm.
right? Or one sibling might really go elsewhere and might act out, right? And might be really challenging in their own way to try to get that attention. And then the sibling who is more well behaved, who's kind of the easier kid, might feel even more that now they're really not getting any attention whatsoever.
Yeah.
And they might resent both of their siblings,
Mm.
right? Um, or the sibling who is acting out, trying to get attention in some way, might resent the easy siblings. It's like, why are you seeing like it's so easy? Like, this is really hard. So there can be a lot of dynamics even between the siblings themselves. And I think a lot of that can get really heightened during the holidays. So that's one piece. And then I think with parents, you know, some credit to the parents. Like, you're trying to balance a lot of different needs. And that's really challenging,
Mm.
you know? And even if parents want to give attention to their other children, depending on whether or not they have the time or the energy or the resources, that can be tough,
Mm.
you know? So, whatever, now speaking to the siblings, I really want to say, like, whatever you're feeling, you're absolutely allowed to feel it. It is so valid. If you're feeling angry or sad or frustrated or resentful and guilty for all of those things, you are absolutely allowed to feel it. I think there's this pressure to be understanding
Mm.
and to be compassionate. And that's not a bad thing, right? I think we as a society should probably all be a little bit more compassionate and a little bit more understanding and patient too,
Mhm.
to neurodivergent folks and to disabled folks. Um, but when that's your whole life, you know, sometimes you're tired, sometimes you're burnt out and you're overwhelmed and you're exhausted and you just want a break. And you should absolutely get to feel that, you know? And so sometimes it really does look like, again, that you have your own space, your own social circle, your own social support network, right? Whether that's friends or whether that's, more professional support, to definitely lean into that, to have your own activities and interests that you can do with your
Mm.
siblings, but also that you can do on your own,
Mm.
right? And speaking to parents, like, this is a really important time, I think, to carve out time for like each of your kids. I know logistically it might feel a little bit impossible, but like if there's a way we can bring in other adult figures to make sure that like you know, maybe the autistic sibling can't do the light show, but someone else can take the typical sibling to do the light
Mm.
show. That would be really, really meaningful, right? So that, yes, there's activities together, but that there's also activities that, each person really wants to do or each person really doesn't want to miss out on, right? That sort of thing. But yes, your feelings are so valid. You absolutely get to validate that. So important for self care, so important to do whatever you have to do to cope.
Mm.
The journaling, walking, taking space for yourself, music, therapy, all of these things,
Mhm.
right? Talking about it. There are, and I can come back to it later, but there are organizations specifically for siblings of, individuals with
Mm.
disabilities. And so, like, seeking out these resources can be really important too.
Yeah. I think, another added layer to this too is culture. And so
Mm-hmm.
I know that I've heard some really unfortunate stories of some neurodivergent siblings, parents being resistant to the label of neurodivergence, of autism, ADHD, etc. And so, one of the most common dialogues I come across with the clients that we work with is they feel guilt for being selfish or having feelings outside of understanding and compassion. And so, guilt has primarily been a huge topic of conversation during the holidays for me. And so out of
Mm-hmm.
curiosity, like what would you say to that person who feels guilt for having anger and for having feelings of unseeness, but also wanting to be selfish during the season? There's a lot of complicated feelings that come with being Asian American during the holidays and being
Yes.
neurodivergent or
Yes.
being a sibling of an Asian American neurodivergent sibling. Yeah.
Yeah. The intersectionality gets a little bit
It
complicated,
does. It
right? With
does.
so much
Mhm.
happening. Um, gosh, with guilt, I think maybe speaking as an Asian person first, speaking as an Asian daughter first, perhaps.
Mhm.
Um, I think guilt is a little bit ingrained in us,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Um, the ways that we, you know, feel a little bit bad just for having our own wants and needs when it's been told to us that we really need to take care of and prioritize the family unit as a whole,
Mm.
right? And this might be, I was raised here in the States, and so it might be a little bit westernized of me, but I think getting the chance to find that balance between, okay, yeah, culture says that we take care of the family. Culture does not say that we don't get to take care of ourselves,
Mm. It's
right?
good.
And I think there's a balance here where you can take care of your own wants and needs, and you are allowed to set boundaries around your time and your space, right? And you're, again, allowed to be angry and upset, and you are allowed to be selfish too, right? And so, if your family is really focused on meeting the needs and accommodating, your neurodivergent sibling or your disabled sibling, that's not a bad thing. In fact, that's a wonderful thing. And also, you are allowed to have your own wants and needs. You're allowed to express your own emotions. You're allowed to set boundaries around your time and space, right? Boundaries, we can't necessarily control anyone else's actions, but we can control our own actions and reactions and where we are, right? In this whole mess of things, right? So if you need to take time away, if you need to only be there for a short period of time, if you need to go do something first, go do whatever activity it is first, and then come, like, that is okay, right? I think the guilt that we feel is premised on the fact that we feel like we're being a bad XYZ sister, daughter, brother, whatever, right? But I think being able to define, well, what does that actually really mean to you, right? What does it mean to be a good sibling, child, whatever, right? Is what you're doing really all that bad? Maybe some people would say so, right? Maybe some people would say that it's selfish. But what do you think? Right? Do you think that it's actually a terrible thing that you're going to go, do whatever the activity is and then join your family so that you can be really wholly present with them while you're with them,
Mm.
right? And so I think it's a little bit of maybe clarifying what your own definitions are of compassion and selflessness versus selfishness, and really reckoning with, like, do you actually think that you're a bad person or that you're doing a bad thing? And can you make space for you in your selfishness, in whatever it is that you want to
Mm.
do, and also your family?
That's such a different and helpful perspective because I think that you're right. Like, as Asian women specifically,
Yeah, specifically.
we're taught to take care of everyone else before ourselves. And it's so hard to look within. It's scary to look within and to go, is this okay? Is what I'm doing okay? And oftentimes for me, like I have to catch myself. I look at other people and I go, is this okay? And so I love that. Like, what do you think? And being able to sit and pause and ask yourself, do I really think this is an evil thing I'm doing? Um, that's so simple and easy. So let's kind of go into to that note,
Mhm.
like the emotional piece. Because being a sibling of someone with neurodivergence, there's a lot of responsibility put on the neurotypical sibling to be the responsible one to quote unquote step
Mhm.
up. And so, what advice do you have for someone being overwhelmed with these expectations, knowing that there's not the structure of work or being in their own place if they want to spend the holidays out of state with their family?
Yeah. Um, well, I think one, I want to just start with saying with siblings, I think the responsibilities and expectations can start really so very young. You know, with older siblings, um, you remember a life where you didn't have your neurodivergent sibling, depending on the age gap. But with the younger siblings, this is all you know,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is your reality. And I think, kind of regardless of birth order, there is this expectation to step up, to be more responsible, to be more stable,
Mm-hmm.
but also to be more flexible, right? To compromise more.
Mm-hmm.
And then depending on the age of the family, right, children and teens are expected to be a little bit more adult, to take on a little bit more of the caregiving
Yeah.
role. But adult siblings, again, depending on the age of the parents, might be in the caregiving role,
Mm.
right? Depending on like if this is later in life, whether or not now you're responsible for the care or responsible as a conservator, right? So for organizing the care,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So I think it's there's so much responsibility there across the lifespan, depending again on like the significance of the neurodivergence or the disability. So that's one thing, that there is more responsibility
Yeah.
and therefore there is more stress, right? There's more chaos that you have to think about and worry about. There's less attention that you necessarily have to yourself. And I don't want to paint it as like this totally negative picture,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
There, I think, again, with neurodiversity, having a neurodivergent sibling can offer really unique perspective and compassion and empathy and patience. But at the same time, right, you might feel so much emotional stress having to be the one to compromise and having to be the one to be flexible.
Mm.
It's very isolating, right? I think we see in siblings, um, from the therapist side, we see a lot of anxiety of like having to be perfect,
Mm.
not being able to fall apart, right? We see a lot of depression and just being isolated and lonely, not just within their family, but also in their social network, right? With school age peers who don't get it, who don't understand, who might ostracize you, right? Or who don't want to come over to your house,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or maybe you don't want them to come over to your
Mm.
house for whatever
Yeah.
reason, right? So that can be really challenging, you know? So with adults, right, it might be something that you have to consider, right? Who is your guest,
Mm-hmm.
right? Who can you have as a guest? Who's going to be understanding? You throw in laws who maybe aren't familiar, who maybe don't understand. That's more stress and more complication that you have to deal with, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so we see anxiety, we see depression. To be honest, we see trauma too,
Mm-hmm.
right? The trauma of unintentional neglect from parents, the trauma of potentially living with a really challenging sibling, whether if they had a lot of externalizing behaviors, maybe they could be very aggressive, or maybe just have really big emotional meltdowns. And like that sort of instability to a young child, right? That is trauma,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So I think there's so much pressure to be understanding and forgiving. And I think, yes, that's good. But also to let yourself feel the entire emotional range of what it is that you do feel and what it is that you are experiencing, and to let yourself be imperfect,
Mm,
right? You are going to get angry. You should,
that's
frankly.
good.
I think you should be angry sometimes, and I think you should be sad sometimes, and I think you should get to express that. Your sibling might not understand, depending on, again, what their significance is. But others, right? Others should get the opportunity to understand. Parents, other siblings, other family members,
Mm,
right? You should get to advocate for yourself, right? That, hey, I want to do this thing, or I don't want to do that thing,
mm,
right? Um, so I think, just getting the chance to know that your wants and needs are just as valid as important, and that if your family can't meet them, you still can,
mhm,
or other people in your life still can. Um, and I think the last piece is to know that it might be a strength that you can compromise and be understanding and be flexible, but know too that that is an unusual demand,
mm,
right? That not every family is having to do. So if you struggle with it, that's okay, because this is hard,
mm.
right? This is really challenging. So giving yourself grace even in that, that this is not an easy thing to do, and you're also living for the first time,
We're all
right?
living for the
Like
first time.
we're all living for the first
Yep.
time. So if you find that you're like, oh, I don't like that I reacted in such a big way, when I know at my core that my sibling doesn't understand or can't do that or can't respond to that, it's okay, right?
Mm,
You're being asked to do a potentially big thing,
yeah.
so it's okay if it's not perfect.
We all get impatient, and I think it
Yeah.
happens. It happens a lot, even in the caregiving community. And I think for
Hmm.
a lot of
Hmm.
siblings, not to say that it feels like this all the time, but sometimes it feels like a caregiver personhood where you have to be attentive to your sibling from time to time. And so, I one final question for you, Angela, and then I'll let you go. But this whole concept of holding your feelings in front of you, I want to get into the topic of what healthy well-being expectations are for the holidays. And so I'm not blinded to the fact that outside of neurodivergence, there could be layers of trauma in families, estrangement in families during the holiday season, sometimes even um, an unwillingness to see family during the holiday season. And so, what expectations for the person listening to this can they have to promote well being? What does that even look like in this context that we're having it now?
Man, I think that's such a big question.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I don't know that I have a easy answer. I think I have more of a tricky
Yeah,
answer,
please.
right? Um, but I think two parts. One, with the holidays, I think it can be really helpful to go into the holidays with a lot of like planning and preparation and forethought. So, whether that looks like to you having really inclusive and accommodating traditions, the decorations, the food, who's invited, who's not invited, like that sort of planning and preparation, I think is important. But also, like, how do you support your well being if you are going home or if you're not, right? What does it look like to protect your own emotional, physical, mental well being? So that might be like you already have, a list of strategies or a list of self care activities or, activities or hobbies or interest that you plan to do, right? Whether that's like, if in the family home, for example, if you're there's a space for your neurodivergent sibling to go to rest and recharge, have a space for you to go and rest and recharge, right? So that you can step away and that you can have a break and like reset and ground yourself, right? That you take a walk before dinner or after dinner, right? That everyone gets a little bit of space from each
Mm,
other, which is not a bad thing, even in like a typical family. Like a lot of people in a crowded room, that gets overwhelming for anybody, right? That you have people that you can talk to and process with sort of before and after, right? That you can do things in your own way that are self soothing for yourself. Like journaling or whatnot, right? Any and all the strategies. But I really want to emphasize like the self expression,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like getting to express all of these things that you're feeling and like the self care, which can involve the self soothing or the social support. So that's kind of like the what, the how
Mm-hmm.
to do this. But I think to answer your question more directly of like what are the expectations, um, I think you should expect it to be hard,
Mm, that's
honestly.
good.
Um, I think the holiday seasons, if you take out all of this, all of the challenges of neurodivergence, of disability, the holidays are
Mm-hmm.
stressful. Like, period. There's travel, there's change in routine, there's disruptions in your everyday life. That in and of itself is stressful.
Mm-hmm.
And when you add back in all of the other stuff, of course it's going to be hard and stressful. And there are ways we can make it easier, but that's not going to make it
Mm,
easy. So if you're feeling the weight of it, that's okay. You're absolutely allowed to feel the weight of it. If you're needing help, bring in the help. You're absolutely allowed to bring in as much help as you need. If you want to leave, leave.
mm,
You can always come back,
mm,
right? You know? Um, but yeah, giving the yourself the chance to protect yourself, and that's really going to be the thing that gives you then the chance to be as present as possible with your sibling or siblings or with your family, right? This is not the time to, hold it in and force yourself to hold it together to try to keep the
not the
peace,
time.
because that's going to, yeah, it's going to give you a terrible time, and then you're not going to feel good spending time with your family, right? So I really do advocate, like, take care of yourself so that you can be there, or not be there if
Mm-hmm.
that's also what you need and what's better for you. Shorter periods, that's okay too.
Yeah.
um so yeah, a lot of thoughtful planning, opportunities for togetherness, opportunities also for being separate if you need. And then I think there's so many resources with like the Sibling Support Project has like various groups. I think Sibling Leadership Network has a lot of articles and resources. And so, like, places like that, I think also can offer like tips, strategies, and like support groups too. That would be helpful.
Mm, that's good. Okay, Angela, where can people find some of your work, some of your writing? If you want to promote anything right now, you can. If not, we can just introduce you as someone who is an amazing licensed therapist and let you go. But I want to give you space to just share whatever you want to share.
Yeah, thanks so much. Um, Maybe I'll just briefly say, you know, this topic is really complicated, and even being neurodivergent myself, that's just one tiny little puzzle piece of what it means to like be neurodivergent in this bigger, wider community. And I think we all can continue to, practice like empathy and compassion and patience and understanding, um, as we like all foster neurodiversity, as we all continue to support it and appreciate it, knowing that like we're all going to continue to learn,
Yeah.
right? It's like an ever growing field, it's an ever changing science. So yeah, I'm really excited to continue to talk about these things though. As for where you can find me, well, my name is Angela Nguyen. I'm an LCSW licensed clinical social worker. You can probably find me in various places online, I think,
Mm-hmm.
through our podcast, through our website, through blogs and things.
Yeah.
But yeah, really excited to continue talking about this. So
Great.
thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. This was fun.
Yeah.